I try to sort of note down your provocations, I mean, in some sense. And I guess, Albert, your provocation was you guys have asked the wrong damn questions and, here are the right ones. But yours was sort of like, higher education will be unbundled and then potentially reassembled into something that will look very different from today's 4-year degree. Brad, your provocation seemed to be that there are big gaps in tactical learning that exist in the higher ed space now that companies like General Assembly are filling. Ashu and I took your provocation to be that universities have to enhance the experiential part of their experience dramatically. And Rick, you were sort of perhaps the most provocative speaker of all. Like, you challenged General Assembly. To me, you said you can't train someone on critical thinking at Code Academy. And so we've got a lot of fodder here, and potentially not a lot of, we've got some potential disagreement, which is always a good place to start. So, I want to sort of stick to the script and say, here are your provocations. Do you guys want to sort of respond to each other's? Yeah.
I'll take a shot.
We want to
at
see
this.
you guys fight.
I
What we
think
mean.
Albert
Yeah.
actually stated the issue beautifully. And I guess I want to disagree that all universities are of one flavor and that one future scenario is the likely outcome of where we're going with disruption. So I think that there will be a serious and complete disaggregation of some parts of the academy. I have no doubt that's correct. I have no doubt that high price, low quality is dead in the water, and much of what exists right now in the higher education landscape in the United States is of that flavor. I also have no doubt that there will be a few, and I don't know how many, I'd like to count them enough where NYU is on the right side of the line. There will be a few elite universities that will maintain the core of what they've done, but have multiple ways of making that happen for their students across a wider array of pricing and access points. So I'll take our university by saying, what is the Global Network University other than an access play that provides a capability globally to give people some residential experience? How much? That remains to be seen. Technology becomes a tool to make physical presence more valuable. Those places with deep investment in physical presence and physical location can do things that those that do not have them can do. And the job of our university is to create a funding mechanism that works for anyone who has the qualifications to receive that education. And that's our challenge to take on, but it doesn't tell me that what we will have is a future of an utterly unbundled NYU. It'll be the rebundled NYU that you might have envisioned as the endpoint. And the problem is making sure that we can keep our boat running ahead with holes in it, keeping those plugged, and at the same time make a better boat.
Okay, so I'm just going to jump in real quick and then sort of, but am I correct in concluding that you're all agreeing about the fact that the physical assets, a physical presence that is something that universities have, and a lot of online sort of startups in the space, are still building, and that's where the universities have the biggest existing advantage, right? In terms of their physical assets, their physical presence. Are you all agreeing that this is something that is going to continue to be really important in the higher education space in the future?
I will definitely agree that getting together in person is really important. Great things happen when you bring people together in a room or on a campus. I think what defines a campus and what is a room and where people can meet, New York Public Library, because they no longer have a lot of books to store and or digitizing the books will have a lot of space. So I think thinking about what is the real estate and how long do people come together and those are, I think, valid questions. But I have no doubt that good things happen when people meet in person.
I'm coming at this from a little bit of an interesting perspective, because in popular culture and in the space, there's a dichotomy of universities with real estate and then startups that are online. I mean, we're a startup with real estate, which is in some ways a really terrible position to be in. But our students love it, and we do it for our students and for our community. And I think it might be a little oversimplistic to say that, it's just about, physical space on one end and disaggregated content on the other end. I mentioned to Rick after he spoke that if we are just simply content and perceived as just content, we are in a terrible place as an organization, General Assembly. But rather, the people who are coming to us are coming to us not just for the content. Clearly, the content has to be good. It's necessary but not sufficient to do what we're trying to do. People come to us because they're lost and lonely. They come to us because they need that community. They need network. They need a network. They need support. They want to plug into something. They want to meet people. They want to be a part of something. 98% of our students who come to us already have a bachelor's degree. So we don't have huge numbers of high school students who are coming to GA. These are people who have gone through the traditional educational process, come out, and then gotten beaten up in the workforce a little bit and said, I need to plug into a new community. I need to reskill up. And now they're coming to General Assembly.
Okay,
so it's a little bit different than just content versus startup.
I mean, that's an interesting place, and I'll just sort of make this point and then move on, which is that, I'm wondering how the General Assembly model might evolve if you have a substitute for college education that does not leave the gaps that you seem to be filling. But let's put that on hold for a second, because I wanted to ask Ashwin for his point of view on this and put him on the spot there in 140 characters or less. Because, you've been through a 4-year college experience recently, and I also know that you spent some time interning at General Assembly.
Mm-hmm.
So you've sort of seen both sides of this. And so do you sort of have a perspective on, whether are they going to be two completely different things fulfilling completely different needs? Or do you think there is a chance that they might converge at some point, given the fact that you have sort of stressed the importance of experiential learning as a gap in university education? And then we can sort of open up for questions.
Sure. I think this is something interesting. A lot of students that I've talked to who have found a lot of value in the experiences that they've had at, at university have said that a lot of these experiences came from them being more self-directed and motivated to seek out these opportunities. That when they go to study abroad, they don't just go to study abroad for kind of 4-month party across Europe, but they have an idea of what they want to accomplish while they're there and certain ideas that they want to think about. So I think, similarly, if you have, this type of course that I talked about that, awarded this investment, this was not a mandatory course. It was something that I only heard about through other friends, so something I had to kind of work my way to go and find. So I think that if the university can be more apparent in the value of the experiential offerings and does a better job branding and communicating this value, and maybe even in some instances building a better framework to make certain experiences mandatory for students, I think there can be a lot of value in that. And in terms of the, General Assembly model, I think it's interesting, as Brad says, because it's not just a digital medium. It's something where the physical presence and plugging into a network is extraordinarily valuable. And they're tackling these kind of skill sets that are relevant for the 21st century. So I think there's going to be some interesting overlap there between how these kind of experiences between both models combine.
I'm Jay Rubin. I'm an adjunct at Stern, and I'm a media consultant. We're talking a lot about revolutions and educations and largely platforms, in my opinion. I'm just wondering if anyone could reflect on the decision makers of these changes in education. And I'm just curious how different it really is in terms of the top down that we have always had determining what the masses should study, what should be available, and how much in the paradigm you're dealing with now there is bottom up, because it's what we're all hearing and we're grateful for. But indeed, it is people who are currently coming out of the traditional elite education system or products of that. And I'm wondering just how much decision-making input in the new structure you're seeing.
I think it's a terrific question. I think what the internet is fundamentally about is bottom-up innovation, and it is the replacement of kind of hierarchies and the funneling up of information, making decisions at the top and funneling them back down, the replacement of that with networks. I think that is the fundamental thrust, and I think where we see a lot of learning happening is, Brad mentioned the word community. There are lots of communities online in varying disciplines that where a lot of the learning is happening very organically bottom up. If you take something like 3D design, for instance, there's a tool called Blender. It's one of many tools out there. There's a huge online community where people teach each other how to use Blender. And nobody centrally decided that that was a thing to learn. Nobody centrally decided here was a curriculum for how you're going to go learn this. It's all happening bottom up. And I think this is a big fundamental theme of that's happening everywhere. Blogging is a form of decentralized commentary. You may think lots of that commentary is bad, but nobody tells the bloggers to wake up and what to write about. And as a result, we have a huge explosion in the content. I think most of this innovation from the adoption side, the people who are beginning to use this, they're choosing themselves what they're using. They're not sort of listening to some master plan as to what they should learn.
I mean, it's almost like it would make the case for, part of the role of whatever intermediary is playing the role that the university plays now. One of the things that they would need to develop is some sort of screening mechanism, because you have this large universe of decentralized content, much like, you have like millions of blogs of widely varying quality. While some university courses may not be all that good, on average, they're pretty good. Or if you have like, sort of learning communities.
Arguable, but.
Yeah, well, that's my position and I'm sticking to it. So, whereas if you have a community in which you're sort of like, sort of learning through this community, the Blender example that you give us, I mean, there is sort of this quality uncertainty, right? And so you might want to sort of take the safe option of going to a tried and trusted, something where sort of there's a minimum floor on quality. Unless there is some sort of digital or real world way in which this can be screened. So do you sort of see the university playing this role in the future? Rick?
So Arun, two thoughts have come through my mind with this question. The first is what I call the wisdom of the crowd. There's a strong intuitive sense that many of us have that the wisdom of the crowd matters. Crowdsourcing matters. eBay has created a marketplace where strangers can trust each other. That's a really human and powerful insight that bottom-up thinking matters. I also want to talk about the tyranny of the majority. The country itself is founded on the notion that majorities don't make the best decisions in all situations. That we as a nation need to rely on the interaction between those that know more and those that know less. Now, who knows more is a contingent question. You can fight about that one. But there are, in fact, those that have greater knowledge about things, those that have greater wisdom about how human interaction takes place. And universities, if they do the job correctly, aggregate that talent in a way that allows them to mediate the crowd and provide better curation services that can happen uncurated. Our role as a university is to be the best curator. Now, how do you do that in a way that is mechanically possible? That's the beauty of shared governance in any university community. We're going to face a top-down that will push and innovate and force change because they are in the business world and in a market, and market-facing, they have to push that product forward to move the place forward. There are those within the structure of the university that may want to be drag on that system, and those that will want to push even further than the leaders. That interaction is what makes faculty governance possible, and what we have to motivate into the years ahead if we are not to stagnate. Because stalemate between top and bottom is a sure way to die.
So I brought up one now, but you brought up unbundling. And two, you brought up the issue of curation, and I think I want to ask the question about whether they're fundamentally in conflict, because I think at the end of the last panel, someone asked Clay, what is the industry that's most like education? I would say it's music, which is, I think the shift to digital fundamentally allows for playlists, unbundling, self-assembly of degrees, if you take it with logical or illogical conclusion. I'm sort of curious for the panel's perspectives on this balancing between curation on the one end and unbundling and self-assembly on the other.
So, Andre, your 8 provocations gave us the ability to conceive of contradictory things occurring at the same time. And so I think your question actually correctly phrases for us the dilemma we face as a university, because we can no longer have monopolies on all knowledge and all information that comes to our doors. We can no longer have the conceit that every one of our faculty is better than every other faculty that exists in every other university and every other place and time. So what is our distinctive value that we can add? And I think it rests along continua that have been described here. We are very good at providing the correct environment for experiential learning. And the more we free faculty from the responsibility of having to deliver pure content and pure, here's an exercise to do, we free them to create greater opportunities for experiential happening.
Amen.
Secondly, we are capable of absorbing enormous amounts of research and enormous amounts of content and putting them into coherent forms for others. That's the core research activity of a university. And that core research activity has to be deployed in the core business that we have, something we haven't done for a long period of time. So adaptive learning technology, that's ours. We should own that. Because learning outcomes are something that we, as a university, if we don't claim the ownership of learning outcomes, GA will. And I don't want GA to be my competitor. I want to buy GA, right? Because I want to.
You heard it here.
I want to absorb their functionality and make it part of what we do in a broad-based delivery system that answers each of these questions, not the way we've done it now by bundling it with incompetent on one side, incompetent on another, but taking the best of breed of each place and putting them together into a package that allows us to be the dominant provider within that space.
Okay, we have
I just have a question just on that before we leave this thread. And this is for you, Albert, and maybe some of the other panels. Is there a dependency between different parts of the value chain where unbundling offers a massive advantage? So what I mean by that is if you're unbundled and focusing on a narrow vertical, the chances are that your input will be better related to actually what you produce. That's a simpler problem. And that's an advantage, I would say, that new entrants would have. That there's a stronger dependency between sort of the production function and the screening, because the screening leads to people who are self-selected for that particular vertical.
So I think 2 parts here. Let me start with the unbundled portions. I think one of the reasons why unbundling is powerful is because if you do one thing, you have an ability to really try to be the best at doing that one thing. And what the internet often lets you do is to do that one thing globally. And so that becomes very, very powerful. So if all you're trying to do is have the best language learning system, adaptive language learning system, and that's all you do, and you get millions of learners on your system will be more powerful at adaptive learning than anybody else's systems. They're very powerful network feedback effects here. As for the question of curation, we're big believers in curation. I think the curatorial model itself, though, I think is up for grabs and question, right? Which is the historic curatorial model was the faculty said, here are the things that we deem interesting, and we're going to hire professors that are going to go teach these things, which is why in traditional academia, often new developments take a very long time. I mean, if I think of the rise of the long slog of behavioral economics, it's because it was being kept down by the man, so to speak. And so I think curation itself, too, will happen differently, where stuff starts on the site, gets picked up by people, and then the new curators will be the people who can read the signals. But the signals themselves will also come from the system, as it were.
Okay, the gentleman in the yellow shirt back there has had his hand up for a while, and then the young lady here.
All right, I think I can talk loud unless Mandy wants to run over here with the mic. Thanks, I'm Foster Provo from Stern. This has been great. Thank you guys. When I think about the value of my university education, right? There's lots and lots of dimensions to it, and I'm really glad that Ashwin was there because when we started the panel, I thought, well, why don't we ask like people who went to the university? Well, wait a minute. So what do I think? Actually, a lot of the stuff that I think when I think of the value of my education, the university education, 30 years later, it's not the training. It's not the first job that I got and whether I was well trained for it. Here I am, and in my spare time I read French literature. I'm a data scientist. It has nothing to do with my job. I read French literature. I actually am a songwriter. You can hear me down at the bitter end down here. And the poetry I studied in university, was very crucial. Crucial to that, right? And so, I'm not saying by any means that this is something that is unique to the old-fashioned university. But when I think that one of the things that really hasn't been discussed, right? Oh, and by the way, of course, problem solving is probably the number one thing that my ability to think about solving problems is probably the number one thing, right? Which was addressed a little bit, And when I think about this, I think unbundling, that's great, right? But if it had just been unbundled, then I probably would not have chosen to study ethics. And then when I have discussions I happen to have had one of our Paduano fellowships in business ethics, and I had studied ethics, And so would I have chosen these things as a 19 or 20-year-old? Or is it part of the fact that I went to a liberal arts school and they had a program of study and I picked to go because that's the kind of education I wanted. And so what are we gonna? I think my point is, let's also think about how do we create structures that give even more choices, but still give people the opportunity to 30 years later have been really glad that they learned this stuff that they might not have picked if they were just trying to get their next job or whatever.
So if we sort of see unbundling, will there be market failure in some sense where you sort of end up with things that not educating people in the things that they should be educated about?
So I think there are really a great many things going on in this question. Let me actually start at the end because I think the end you said, or somebody said, just people just trying to learn the things they need to get the next job. I think one of the things that hasn't been said yet that I think is super important that also influences all of this is Richard cited a statistic of a decline in real wages. And Brad cited a statistic of the high unemployment rate. There's a lot of evidence that labor is disappearing. And we can have a long discussion around this, but I'm a firm believer that we are seeing the beginnings of the end of work. And so I do think that thinking about what is it that we actually all do when there is far less work than there are people, I think is a super important question. And that goes then to how do we discover our passions? And how do we get interested in French literature or songwriting? And I would argue that has to start way before university. I think, in fact, we're making a huge mistake right now by doubling down on highly standardized education, a highly mechanistic model of high school, when it's very clear to me anyhow that what we should be doing is figuring out how to expose very young students to as many different things as possible. It's one of the reasons we're homeschooling, and my son just went on a huge ethics bender out of completely nowhere. There's something that he read, and he got really interested, and for the last couple of weeks, all he's been reading is sort of various ethics tracts. And I think that model of serendipitous discovery of an interest is almost completely foreclosed for most people who are in high school. And I think that's a huge issue that we shouldn't be solving at the university level. We need to start addressing that way earlier.
Yeah, I think another thing, I totally agree as well. I think another thing that hasn't been brought up here that's worth bringing up is the idea of lifelong learning. That is, it seems like you're a lifelong learner. That is not someone who just, went through 16 years of traditional education and then said, great, I'm done. I'm going to go work now, and now I'm working, and I'm not going to learn anymore. Yeah. I mean, that is the model that has existed for, in the public conscious for some time. And I think given the pace that technology is changing and the pace at which jobs and work are changing, that model has gone from a little bit antiquated to just completely out the window. Like, people have to go back to school, however you define school, whether that's, you know, Codecademy or GA or something else, you know, people have to go back to school at several points during their career, if not, you know, an ongoing set of learning experiences. So I think that's important to keep in mind here, and might be the savior of the liberal arts. Who knows? That people just think about education differently.
Any sort of like final thoughts? Well, why don't we take sort of one more point, and then we really have to wrap up and move on to the next session by 4:10. So let's just sort of take one final comment and maybe two final points.
Thank you. So my question revolves around the other half of the equation. We've been talking about education, but we've also been talking about it in the context of research universities primarily. And it is a secret, for the most part, that education in many institutions subsidizes the research portfolio of those institutions. And it tends to flow upward in the sense that undergraduate education subsidizes graduate education. Graduate education creates teaching assistants, research assistants, who work with faculty to facilitate discovery, which is perceived to be a very valuable product from the higher education system in the United States. Accepting that there are inefficiencies in the system, and having eliminated many of them here at NYU, but certainly not all of them, accepting that some research, to your point, Albert, is not high quality research. Nonetheless, it's generally accepted that it's a great strength of not only our country but other countries that the research university prevails. And I'm concerned about what happens when the revenue streams, which are already being compressed at the federal and state level in support of research, are further compressed by the loss of, I'm going to call it what it is, a research subsidy paid by undergraduates to universities around the world.
This question is not dissimilar from the question, how does quality journalism get financed in a world where all the other content is free, right? So you had these bundled systems, and so this question arises in many different areas. And I don't think there's a simple answer to it at all. I do think that two things. Number one, we have an issue with kind of an anti-commons, intellectual anti-commons, where every university, is trying to, even in fundamental research, try to find things that they can patent and then have a patent portfolio that they can license. There's a fascinating web effort out there called Polymath, where mathematicians have been collaborating across universities. So I think if we had much more collaboration, I think we could do way more with way less money. We still need some money at the end of the day to fund these things. But I do think we need to also think about what's the right intellectual property regime in which truly collaborative global research can occur, as opposed to sort of stovepipe research because you're rushing to publish a paper because the funding mechanism is based on the number of citations. We have all these sort of negative loops that worked in the past and we need to break. I do think among many other things, and I'm not saying that's the panacea, but among many other things, I do think a certain amount of science will be crowdfunded. There's some very sort of early efforts to do that. And they're earlier than the crowdfunding for movies, but these days, $10 and $20 million movies are getting crowdfunded, so I think $10 and $20 million research projects are going to get crowdfunded at some point. There are much larger scale research projects that can't be financed that way, but I do think that is part of the answer.
Okay, we've got about a minute left, so Ashwin, Rick, Brad, any sort of final thoughts in 20 seconds or less?
140 characters or less?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I just want to draw back to that point about the research, kind of students subsidizing that research. I wonder, I don't understand the interaction of how research is subsidized and what that research goes towards, but I wonder if in the future that the industries who benefit from this research will play a part in subsidizing this at the university level to offload the burden off the students.
They already do.
I think that is a way to make this experience much more cost effective.
So 2 quick points. How high is the floor? How low is the ceiling? We have to have a minimum level of delivery of education across this country, across this world, to move people forward in their lives. That's a real problem that we have to deal with. How low is the ceiling is the empowerment of each individual to reach their maximum potential. We have to have a stake in that. That's a university's role. I want to end with a quick thought from Kurt Vonnegut. Vonnegut says there are two things we can contrast, that which is a granfalloon and that which is karass. Granfalloon is like the Knights of Columbus, it's like your local sports affiliation and booster group. It's a balloon filled with air that when you pop the balloon, nothing is left. That's a network. It's not a very good network. Karass is deep, long-term, connected in a way that sustains itself over a long period of time. Universities must exhibit karass, not granfalloon.
Brad, do you have anything to add to that?
Not directly to that, but I actually wanted. I was thinking of an interesting note on the research point. So one of the biggest challenges to scale here at General Assembly is how do we deliver courses that are taught by practitioners, taught by people who are actually working as developers and designers, as we scale and as we grow, and how do we keep that principle? Because we need to hire full-time faculty at some point just to scale this. So one of the points we arrived at that we're experimenting with right now is someone will be full-time at GA, will teach a couple of classes, and then in their spare time will work on really innovative and interesting open source technology projects. So in some ways we've come all the way full circle back into the research university.
Okay, I think a sign of a good panel is that there are many, many unasked questions among the audience, or maybe that's the sign of a bad moderator. I don't know.